A black man goes undercover in luxury store. The racist owner kicks him out and gets karma next day. The bitter December wind whipped through Fifth Avenue as John Bennett stood motionless in the falling snow, watching his luxury store from across the street. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as memories of his mother's last words echoed in his mind. Never forget where you came from, Johnny. But more importantly, never forget who you want to become. 20 years later, those words still haunted him. As snowflakes settled on his simple black jacket and baseball cap, he pulled the worn fabric closer, the same jacket his mother had mended countless times during those harsh winters when they barely had enough to eat. Today, he wasn't John Bennett the billionaire. He was just another face in the crowd, about to uncover a truth that would shake his empire to its core. Have you found a cozy spot to watch this touching story? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button. John Bennett's story began in the basement apartment of a dilapidated building in the Bronx, where his mother, Martha Bennett, worked as a housekeeper for the wealthy Coleman family on the Upper East Side. Every morning she would wake before dawn, kiss her sleeping son's forehead, and make the long subway journey to maintain the pristine mansion of those who barely acknowledged her existence. Martha had always dreamed of providing her son with an education she never had. Despite working 14-hour days, she would spend her evenings teaching John to read using discarded magazines from the Coleman's trash. Her hands, cracked and raw from cleaning chemicals, would gently guide his fingers across the pages, teaching him that knowledge was the one thing nobody could take away. The winter of 1994 proved particularly cruel. When 12-year-old John found his mother collapsed in their frozen apartment, her lungs weakened by years of exposure to harsh cleaning products and inadequate medical care, his world shattered. The Colemans, despite Martha's 15 years of service, sent only a generic sympathy card and 2 weeks severance pay. That night, as John huddled alone in the city morgue, he made 2 promises: he would never let anyone suffer the indignity his mother endured, and he would build something that would make her proud. With only a 6th grade education, John began working 3 jobs: newspaper delivery before dawn, dishwashing after school, and night shifts at a convenience store. Every spare moment was spent in the public library, teaching himself business, economics, and fashion through borrowed textbooks. By 16, he had saved enough to rent a small cart, selling second-hand designer items he carefully restored. His mother's attention to detail and cleaning had taught him the value of presentation. He learned to spot quality beneath damaged surfaces, just as his mother had always seen potential in him. Each sale brought him closer to his dream, each satisfied customer a brick in the foundation of his future empire. Through sheer determination and an unwavering work ethic inherited from his mother, John's business grew. He went from a cart to a small shop, then to multiple locations. By 30, John Bennett had transformed his mother's lessons in perseverance into a chain of luxury stores that redefined high-end retail. But success hadn't erased the memory of those cold winters, of his mother's sacrifice, or of the treatment she endured at the hands of those who saw her as beneath them. Now at 42, John Bennett was worth billions, but few knew the truth of his origins. His empire was built not just on luxury goods, but on the principle that every person, regardless of their appearance or background, deserved respect. It was a lesson written in his mother's calloused hands and final breaths, a lesson he was about to put to the test in ways he never imagined. By 2024, Bennett Luxury Group had become synonymous with both opulence and integrity. Unlike traditional luxury brands that thrived on exclusivity, John's stores operated on a revolutionary principle. Authentic luxury wasn't about keeping people out, but about making everyone feel worthy of extraordinary experiences. Each of his 37 stores worldwide had strict policies against discrimination, with regular mystery shopper evaluations and mandatory sensitivity training. John had implemented a unique open door. initiative where stores would provide warm shelter during harsh weather conditions regardless of whether people intended to make purchases. This policy, inspired by his own memories of seeking warmth in department stores during homeless winters after his mother's death, had initially faced resistance from traditional luxury retail experts. The flagship store on Fifth Avenue held particular significance. It stood exactly where John had once sold items from his cart, braving winter storms and skeptical looks from passers-by. Now, its elegant facade housed not just designer goods, but also a hidden memorial, a small photograph of Martha Bennett in the staff area, reminding employees that true value wasn't in the price tags they handled, but in how they treated every person who walked through their doors. This winter had special meaning. It marked the 20th anniversary of Bennett Luxury Group's founding, and John had launched his most ambitious initiative yet, the Martha Bennett Foundation, dedicated to providing healthcare and education support for service workers and their children. The program had already helped hundreds of families escape the cycle of poverty that had claimed his mother's life. Yet, despite his success, John maintained his mother's humble approach to life. He regularly worked incognito in his stores, serving customers without revealing his identity. His executive office, unlike the opulent spaces of his peers, contained just one luxury item: his mother's worn leather wallet, empty except for the sympathy card from the Colemans, a reminder of why he started this journey. Each December, he increased the mystery shopper visits, knowing the holidays often brought out both the best and worst in people. This year, with record-breaking cold temperatures predicted and his newest store manager, Richard Coleman, coincidentally sharing a surname with his mother's former employers, showing concerning performance reports, John felt particularly uneasy. The security footage from his stores showed subtle but troubling patterns, certain customers receiving markedly different treatment based on their appearance, elderly visitors being hurried out despite the bitter cold, and a growing tension among staff that reminded him too much of the social hierarchies that had once kept his mother cleaning other people's homes until it killed her. As snowflakes continued to fall on Fifth Avenue, John adjusted his worn baseball cap, the same one he'd worn during his cart selling days, and prepared to enter his own store as a customer. What he didn't know was that this routine check would unravel a web of connections to his past that would force him to confront not just discrimination in his store, but the very foundations of his success and the true cost of forgiveness. Snow crunched beneath John's boots as he pushed open the heavy glass door of his flagship store. The familiar chime announced his entrance, but this time no one rushed to greet him. Instead, he watched as Richard Coleman, the store manager, finished assisting a well-dressed woman, his smile professional and engaging. The contrast in treatment became immediately apparent when an elderly woman shuffled in behind John, seeking refuge from the biting cold. Her worn coat and weather-beaten shopping bags drew disapproving glances from Richard. The woman reminded John painfully of his mother, the same weathered hands, the same dignified bearing despite obvious hardship. "Ma, Richard's voice cut through the ambient music, sharp and cold as the weather outside. "This isn't a warming center, unless you're planning to make a purchase." Before he could finish, a young assistant manager, Sarah Moore, quickly intervened. "Please take a moment to warm up," she said softly, guiding the woman to a plush velvet chair. "Would you like some tea?" The elderly woman's eyes welled with grateful tears as Sarah disappeared into the back room. John moved through the store, examining a display of watches, the same brand his mother had once cleaned in the Coleman mansion. He noticed Richard's eyes following him, the manager's expression shifting from mild annoyance to barely concealed disdain at John's casual attire and worn baseball cap. "Can I help you?" Richard's tone suggested the opposite of assistance. When John inquired about a particularly expensive timepiece, Richard's response was cutting. "Perhaps something more suitable for your budget. We have some entry-level pieces that might be more appropriate." The words struck John like physical blows, each syllable resonating with memories of similar dismissals his mother had endured. As he pressed for details about the watch, Richard's patience visibly thinned. "Sir, these pieces are for serious collectors. The price point alone." A commotion near the entrance interrupted them. The elderly woman had accidentally knocked over a display while trying to retrieve her shopping bags. As Richard stormed toward her, John noticed something that stopped him cold. The woman was clutching an old leather wallet, identical to his mother's. "This is exactly why we can't have," Richard began, but Sarah again intercepted, helping the woman gather her belongings. "My late daughter worked here once," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "She used to tell me how beautiful everything was. I just wanted to see." John's heart nearly stopped. He recognized her now, Mrs. Thompson, whose daughter had worked alongside his mother at the Coleman mansion. She had attended his mother's funeral, bringing a homemade casserole when the Colemans had sent only a card. The past and present collided in that moment, as Richard's contemptuous expression mirrored the same look John had seen on the faces of his mother's employers 2 decades ago. But this time he had the power to do something about it. The elderly woman's presence had created a palpable tension in the store. Richard's behavior became increasingly aggressive, moving from subtle discrimination to overt hostility. "We'll be closing early today due to the weather," he announced loudly, though it was barely mid-afternoon. His eyes fixed pointedly on Mrs. Thompson and John. Sarah Moore, however, continued her quiet rebellion. As Richard turned away, she slipped Mrs. Thompson a business card. "Call me if you need anything," she whispered. "Your daughter, she was Martha Bennett's friend, wasn't she?" The mention of his mother's name sent a chill through John that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Richard's attention shifted back to John, who had moved to examine a collection of designer coats. "Sir, those pieces require careful handling," he said, stepping between John and the display. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at our outlet location." The suggestion carried the same dismissive tone John remembered from countless encounters in his youth. As John observed, Richard's pattern became clear. Well-dressed customers received effusive attention, while others faced increasing levels of scrutiny. A young black couple examining engagement rings were quickly steered toward less expensive options. An Asian student in casual clothes was followed discreetly by security at Richard's subtle signal. But it was Richard's interaction with a cleaning woman that truly caught John's attention. She had entered briefly to escape the storm, wearing the same uniform company logo that his mother had worn. Richard's reaction was immediate, and visceral. "Service entrance is around back," he snapped. "This area is for customers only." The scene triggered a flash of memory. His mother, soaking wet from rain, being directed to use the service entrance at the Coleman mansion even during thunderstorms. The parallel was uncanny, and John felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Sarah attempted to intervene again, offering the cleaning woman shelter, but Richard pulled her aside. John overheard their heated whisper, "Your bleeding heart will cost you your job, Miss Moore. We have standards to maintain. You didn't invest years building connections with the right families just to turn this place into a homeless shelter." The words "right families" echoed in John's mind, reminding him of overheard conversations from the Coleman household about keeping the help in their place. As he watched Richard's commanding presence move through the store, something else struck him, a familiar arrogance in his bearing, a certain tilt of the head that sparked a distant memory. John pulled out his phone, quickly searching through old news archives. There was a society page photo from 20 years ago, a younger Richard Coleman standing beside his father, Theodore Coleman, at a charity gala. The same Theodore Coleman who had employed Martha Bennett, who had sent that impersonal card after her death. The connection was more than coincidence. Richard wasn't just any manager with discriminatory practices. He was the son of the man whose actions had contributed to Martha Bennett's death. And now he was running John's store, perpetuating the same cycles of discrimination that John had built his empire to fight against. As this story of justice, redemption, and human dignity unfolds, perhaps you find yourself moved by John's journey and the hidden connections that shape our lives. If Martha's story resonates with your heart as it does with others, consider showing your support by hitting the like button to help more people discover this powerful tale of social transformation. The following day brought heavier snow and an even darker revelation. John returned to the store, this time equipped with a small recording device not for legal purposes, but to ensure his growing suspicions weren't clouded by personal bias. The morning light cast long shadows through the store's windows, creating an almost theatrical setting for what was about to unfold. As he browsed the luxury handbag section, John witnessed a scene that made his blood run cold. A young woman dressed in scrubs and a worn winter coat entered the store. Her hands were raw from sanitizer, reminiscent of his mother's cleaning scarred fingers. She approached the counter timidly, pulling out a carefully counted stack of bills. "It's my mother's 60th birthday," she explained to Richard. "I've been saving for 6 months to buy her something special. She's always wanted." Richard cut her off with a raised hand. "Our financing options require a certain credit score threshold," he said, despite the cash in her hands. "Perhaps a department store would be more appropriate." Sarah, who had been organizing nearby displays, stepped forward. "I can help you," she offered, but Richard intercepted. "Miss Moore, I need you in the back office. Now." As Sarah reluctantly retreated, John noticed tears welling in the nurse's eyes. She clutched her money tighter, the same way his mother used to hold her hard-earned wages. Before leaving, she whispered something that carried across the quiet store. "My mother cleans houses too. I just wanted her to feel special for once." The parallel was overwhelming. John found himself following Sarah to the back office, positioning himself near the partially open door. The conversation inside confirmed his worst fears. "Your bleeding heart will be the end of you, Miss Moore." Richard's voice dripped with contempt. "Do you know how hard my father worked to maintain standards in this industry? We can't just let everyone with a few saved dollars dilute our brand." "They're human beings, Mr. Coleman." Sarah's voice shook but held firm. "And that nurse probably works harder than half our regular clients." "Like your sister." Richard's tone turned menacing. "How is she, by the way? Still need those expensive treatments? It would be a shame if your insurance coverage became complicated." John's hand tightened on his recording device. The threat was clear. Richard was using Sarah's vulnerable family situation to enforce his discriminatory practices. But it was what happened next that truly shook John. As he moved away from the door, he overheard Richard on the phone. "Yes, Father, the store is running exactly as you taught me. No, I haven't forgotten how the Bennetts nearly ruined us when that cleaning woman died. Her son? Probably ended up in the system where they belong. Don't worry, I'm maintaining our standards." The pieces clicked into place. Richard didn't just share a surname with John's mother's former employers, he was actively continuing their legacy of discrimination, using his position in John's store to perpetuate the very prejudices that had contributed to Martha Bennett's death. Through the office window, John caught sight of a small shrine Sarah had created in the break room, photographs of employees' loved ones. Among them, partially hidden, was a familiar face, his mother, Martha Bennett. The photo must have come from Mrs. Thompson, and Sarah had given it a place of honor. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Sarah's quiet resistance against Richard's oppression, all while unknowingly honoring the mother of the man who owned the store. John's hand moved to his phone, ready to end this charade, but something held him back. There was more to uncover, and now he knew exactly where to look. That evening, as the winter storm intensified, John sat in his office overlooking Manhattan's snow-covered skyline, piecing together a web of connections that stretched back 2 decades. His investigator's report painted a picture more complex than he'd imagined. Theodore Coleman, Richard's father, hadn't simply been Martha Bennett's employer. He'd been a man desperate to maintain his social standing while his business crumbled. The year Martha died, the Coleman family had been secretly bankrupt, maintaining appearances while cutting corners on staff health care and safety measures. The money that could have saved Martha's life had instead funded their social appearances. But the report revealed something even more startling. Richard's daughter, Emily, was battling the same respiratory condition that had claimed Martha's life. Medical bills had pushed Richard to the brink of financial ruin. He was about to lose his home, and Emily's treatments were falling behind. The bitter irony wasn't lost on John. Richard was now facing the same desperate circumstances his father had created for others. Sarah's story proved equally heartbreaking. Her younger sister, Amy, suffered from a rare immune disorder, the same condition that had compromised Martha Bennett's lungs when exposed to cleaning chemicals. Sarah had been working double shifts, secretly selling her belongings to help fund Amy's treatments. Her quiet acts of kindness in the store came from a place of deep personal understanding. The most shocking discovery came in the form of an old letter found in Theodore Coleman's recently auctioned estate. Written by Martha Bennett just days before her death, it had never been delivered. Dear Mr. Coleman, I know times are difficult for everyone. I don't ask for much, just enough to see a doctor. Not for myself, but for my Johnny. He's been coughing too, and I fear the cleaning chemicals. Please, not for me, but for my boy. With respect. With respect, Martha Bennett. The letter had been marked "Returned to sender." Theodore Coleman had refused it without reading it. Now, 20 years later, his son Richard was perpetuating the same cruel cycle, while his own daughter fought for breath in a hospital bed. As John read through the documents, his phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. Mr. Coleman is asking staff to sign new contracts tomorrow. Anyone who's helped undesirable customers will be terminated. He mentioned my sister's insurance. I don't know what to do. Attached was a photo that made John's heart stop. A young girl in a hospital bed, bearing a striking resemblance to Emily Coleman, was holding hands with Sarah's sister, Amy. They were in adjacent beds in the same hospital ward, both fighting to breathe, both victims of a system that valued appearance over humanity. The final piece of the puzzle was a security camera footage from the store's back entrance. It showed Richard, late at night, secretly leaving bags of expensive clothes and food for the cleaning woman he'd dismissed earlier. His face showed a complex mix of shame, guilt, and fear, a man trapped between his father's toxic legacy and his own desperate circumstances. John's hand trembled as he reached for his mother's old wallet. Inside, behind the Coleman's callous sympathy card, he found a faded photograph: young Richard Coleman playing with a small John Bennett at a staff Christmas party, both children unaware of the social boundaries that would later divide them. Tomorrow would bring choices that would change lives forever. But tonight, as the snow continued to fall, John Bennett sat alone with the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. The morning light struggled through heavy snow clouds as John prepared for what would be the most challenging day of his career. His investigation had revealed layers of complexity that demanded more than simple retribution. In his private office, John meticulously laid out the evidence: the security footage, Richard's financial records, Sarah's documented incidents of discrimination, and most painfully, his mother's undelivered letter. Each piece told part of a larger story of generational trauma and systemic prejudice. Before confronting Richard, John arranged a series of crucial meetings. First was Dr. Angela Chen, the hospital's chief of pediatrics, who confirmed what the records suggested: both Emily Coleman and Amy Moore were being treated for environmentally induced respiratory conditions, a cruel echo of Martha Bennett's fate. We could save both girls, Dr. Chen explained, but the experimental treatment costs are astronomical. Mr. Coleman has already sold his family home, and Miss Moore, she paused. Sarah works extra shifts here as a volunteer, just to be near her sister. John's next meeting was with James Wilson, his head of HR, who revealed disturbing patterns in Richard's management. He maintains 2 different employee files, James explained. One for show, one with detailed notes about employees' vulnerabilities, sick relatives, financial struggles, anything he can leverage. But there's something else. He hesitated. Late at night, Richard's been using store funds to anonymously help certain employees in crisis. It's embezzlement, technically, but it's like he's fighting himself. The most revealing conversation came from Margaret, the elderly cleaning woman who'd been dismissed the day before. Her testimony shook John to his core. "Mr. Coleman, Richard, he stops me around the corner every night," she whispered. "He gives me warm clothes, food, money for medicine. He cries sometimes, says he's sorry, talks about his daughter. Says he can't let anyone see him being kind because weakness cost his father everything but his eyes, they're haunted, just like his father's were that night, your mother." She broke off, and John realized she had been there the night his mother collapsed. The connections kept deepening, the past and present intertwining in ways he hadn't imagined. John spent hours reviewing security footage from the past 6 months. It revealed Richard's Jekyll and Hyde existence, harsh and discriminatory during business hours, but at night, secretly helping the very people he'd spurned. He watched Richard sobbing in his office after particularly cruel interactions, looking at photos of his daughter, making anonymous donations to children's hospitals. Sarah's personnel file told its own story. Despite Richard's public harassment, her performance reviews showed glowing feedback from customers of all backgrounds. She'd created an unofficial support network among staff, helping them navigate Richard's complex behaviors while maintaining their dignity. As evening approached, John made 2 final calls. First to his bank, arranging for a substantial transfer to the hospital's research fund. The second was to his lawyer, drafting 2 documents, Richard's termination papers, and beside them something else, a contract that could offer redemption, but at a price. Looking out at the thickening snow, John remembered his mother's last words about becoming the person he wanted to be. The easy path would be to expose Richard's discrimination and destroy him publicly. It would be justified, even celebrated in today's climate. But his mother had taught him that true justice required something harder than courage to break cycles of harm. He pressed the intercom. "Lisa, please arrange for Richard Coleman and Sarah Moore to meet me in the main conference room tomorrow at 9 a.m. And book the children's ward conference room at Mount Sinai for noon." As he gathered the documents, a final security alert popped up on his screen. Richard was still at the store, long after closing. The camera showed him standing before Martha Bennett's photo in the break room, his shoulders shaking with sobs, while through the window behind him, snow continued to fall on a city full of people just trying to breathe. The conference room sat in heavy silence as Richard Coleman entered, his usual confident stride diminished by obvious fatigue. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights, his designer suit slightly rumpled, a man coming undone. Sarah Moore arrived moments later, freezing briefly when she saw Richard before taking a seat as far from him as possible. Her hands clutched a worn envelope, her sister's latest medical bills, John would later learn. "Thank you both for coming," John began, still wearing his casual attire from his undercover visits. Recognition flickered across Richard's face, followed by dawning horror. Sarah's eyes widened in understanding. "Mr. Bennett, I can explain," Richard stammered, his carefully constructed facade cracking. "The store's performance numbers are excellent. Our luxury brand positioning." Stop. John's voice was quiet but firm. He placed his mother's undelivered letter on the table. "Do you recognize this handwriting, Richard?" The color drained from Richard's face as he stared at Martha Bennett's neat script. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Those letters were destroyed. My father made sure." "So you knew?" John's words hung in the air. "You knew who I was, whose store you were running, and still chose to continue your father's legacy of discrimination." Sarah watched the exchange in stunned silence, pieces falling into place. "The photo in the break room," she breathed. "That's your mother." John nodded, then turned back to Richard. "Tell me about Emily," he said softly. Richard's composure shattered completely. "How do you?" "She's getting worse," he choked out. "The treatments aren't working. I've sold everything, but it's not enough. I can't lose her like my mother died," John finished, gasping for air because your father decided maintaining appearances was more important than human life. Tears streamed down Richard's face. "I became everything I hated," he whispered. "Every night I look at Emily and see all the people I've hurt. I try to help them in secret, but it's never enough. I'm trapped in this persona my father created." Sarah spoke up, her voice trembling. "The anonymous donations to the hospital's respiratory ward. That was you." Richard nodded miserably. "Half my salary. But it's not enough. Nothing is ever enough." John opened a folder, spreading out security photos. Richard secretly helping employees, leaving supplies for the homeless, crying in his office. "You're at war with yourself, Richard, maintaining your father's cruel legacy in public while trying to atone in private." "My father lost everything by showing weakness," Richard said hoarsely. "I thought if I was harsh enough, strong enough, I could protect Emily from what's coming. But I've become a monster." "No," John said quietly, "you've become your father's son. But you have a choice about what happens next." He placed 2 documents on the table. Option 1, immediate termination with all your actions made public. Option 2, he paused, sliding over the second contract. Something harder. Richard's hands shook as he read the document. Sarah leaned forward, her own eyes widening at its contents. "A full scholarship program for service workers' children," John explained, "named in honor of Martha Bennett and managed jointly by all of us. Full medical coverage for Emily and Amy included. But it requires something from you, Richard." "Anything?" Richard whispered. "Public acknowledgement of your father's actions, full transparency about your own behavior, and most importantly, you'll work alongside the very people you once dismissed, learning what true dignity means." Richard stared at the contract, tears falling onto the paper. "I don't deserve this chance." "No," John agreed, "but my mother believed in redemption. She believed the cycle of cruelty could be broken. The question is, do you?" Sarah reached across the table, her hand covering Richard's. "Amy and Emily share a hospital room," she said softly. "They hold hands during treatments. Maybe it's time we followed their example." Outside, the snow continued to fall on Fifth Avenue as 3 people sat in silence, the weight of the past and the possibility of the future hanging between them. The choice that would reshape their lives lay waiting in black and white before them. The emotional tension in the conference room peaked as John pulled out one final piece of evidence, a yellowed envelope from his mother's personal effects. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "Before I let you make your choice, Richard, there's something you need to see." John's voice was steady despite his inner turmoil. "This was found in my mother's belongings after her death." Inside was a child's drawing, crude but touching, 2 boys holding hands, one labeled Richie and the other Johnny beneath it, in a child's unsteady scrawl, "Best friends forever, Christmas 1989. Richard's face crumpled as recognition hit him. "I remember," he whispered. "We used to play together when my father was at work. Your mother would sneak me cookies." His voice broke. "My father found out and fired her," John finished. "Sent her out into the worst winter storm in decades because he couldn't bear the thought of his son befriending the help's child." Sarah watched in stunned silence as the story unfolded. Richard's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. "She died 3 weeks later," John continued, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "But that's not all she left behind." He produced another document, a diary entry dated the day before her death. "Dear Johnny," he read aloud. "Today young Richard snuck in through the service entrance. He was crying because his father had destroyed all his toys for playing with you. He asked why people have to be cruel. I told him what I'll tell you now: cruelty is a choice." And so is kindness. We must always choose kindness even when it costs us everything. Richard collapsed into his chair, decades of carefully constructed barriers crumbling. I remember that day he gasped. She held me while I cried, said I didn't have to become my father. But I was so scared, so angry. I did become him, didn't I? John stood walking to the window. The snow outside intensified, much like that fatal night. Your father's bankruptcy wasn't just about bad business decisions, was it, Richard? No, Richard whispered. He'd been embezzling funds for years. When your mother died, there was an investigation. He paid to cover it up, but it cost him everything. He blamed your family, said maintaining appearances was the only way to survive. I believed him. God help me, I believed him. Sarah, who had been quietly absorbing everything, suddenly gasped. The hospital bills I found in your office, they weren't just Emily's, were they? Richard shook his head, tears flowing freely now. I've been secretly paying for treatments for employees' children, every spare penny, trying to atone. But I kept up the act in public because I thought it was the only way to protect Emily. I became the monster my father was, all while trying to fight against everything he stood for. John turned back from the window, his expression complex. And now your daughter fights for breath just as my mother did. In the same hospital, same wing, holding hands with Sarah's sister. The cycles we create come back to haunt us, Richard. I don't deserve forgiveness, Richard choked out. What I've done, who I've become. This isn't about forgiveness, John said quietly. It's about breaking cycles. My mother's last words to me weren't about revenge. They were about becoming who we choose to be, not who we're taught to be. He placed a final photo on the table, Martha Bennett and a young Richard Coleman, sitting on a worn couch, reading a story together. On the back was written in Martha's hand, remember, Richard, you have your father's name but your mother's heart. Choose wisely. Your mother, John said softly. She died when you were young, didn't she? That's why you spent so much time with my mother. Richard nodded, unable to speak. Then you understand better than anyone the cost of these cycles of cruelty. The question is, are you ready to end them? The snow fell heavier outside, blanketing the city in white, as three people sat with the weight of their shared past and the possibility of a different future. The choice before them wasn't just about a job or a contract, it was about the kind of world they would help create. Sarah reached out, taking both men's hands. Maybe, she said quietly, this is what your mother meant, Mr. Bennett. Maybe this is how we become who we're meant to be, by facing our past and choosing a different path forward. The moment hung between them, heavy with decades of pain, loss, and the faint stirring of hope. Outside, the city continued its winter dance, unaware that in a quiet conference room the cycle of generations was about to be broken or reinforced by the choices made in the next few moments. The silence in the conference room was broken by an urgent knock. Lisa, John's assistant, entered with a pale face. Mr. Bennett, there's an emergency call from Mount Sinai Hospital. Both Emily Coleman and Amy Moore have been admitted to intensive care. The world seemed to stop. Richard stumbled to his feet, his face ashen. Sarah let out a small cry, her hands clutching the edge of the table. John felt the weight of history pressing down on him as he remembered another winter day, another hospital call. My car's downstairs, John said quietly. We'll all go. The drive to the hospital was tense with unspoken fears. Richard sat rigid, his hands clasped in prayer, while Sarah silently wept. John drove through the thickening snow, memories of his mother's final journey overlaying every intersection. At the hospital, they found both girls in adjacent beds, holding hands despite their oxygen masks. Emily Coleman, pale and thin like her father, and Amy Moore, with Sarah's determined eyes, fighting for every breath just as Martha Bennett had done 2 decades ago. Dr. Chin met them in the hallway. Their conditions are critical. The cold snap has aggravated their symptoms. We need to make decisions about aggressive treatment options immediately. Richard crumpled against the wall. I can't pay for more treatments. I've lost everything. The proud man who had dismissed others so easily was gone, replaced by a desperate father watching history repeat itself. Sarah's voice shook as she spoke. The experimental treatment. Could it help them both? Yes, Dr. Chin replied, but the cost. I'll pay, John said firmly. All eyes turned to him. For both girls. Richard looked up, his face a mask of shock and shame. Why? After everything I've done. Everything my family did to yours. Because 20 years ago, no one made this choice for my mother, John replied, his voice thick with emotion. Because two innocent girls shouldn't pay for the sins of their fathers. Because my mother believed that breaking cycles was more important than maintaining them. He turned to Richard. But there's a condition. This ends now. The discrimination, the facade, all of it. You helped me build something new from the ashes of what our fathers created. Richard stared through the window at his daughter, then at the hand holding girls who had found friendship despite the barriers their families had built. I've spent my life hiding kindness, thinking it was weakness, he whispered. Becoming my father to fight my father's ghost. Sarah stepped forward. Then let's kill that ghost, together. These girls don't see social barriers or class differences. They just see friends helping each other breathe. And a nurse emerged from the room. Emily's asking for you, Mr. Coleman. And Amy wants her sister. Richard hesitated at the door, then turned to John. Your mother, he said softly the day before she died. She told me something I've never forgotten. She said, Richie, being kind isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing you can be. I didn't understand then. I do now. They entered the room together, past and present merging as they watched their girls fight for breath. John stood back, seeing his mother in every face, in Sarah's devotion, in Richard's desperation, in the girls' innocent friendship. Emily removed her oxygen mask briefly. Daddy, she whispered, don't cry. Amy helps me be brave. Amy squeezed her friend's hand. We take turns, she said softly. When one can't breathe, the other breathes for both of us. Richard fell to his knees between their beds. I'm so sorry, he sobbed, decades of suppressed emotion breaking free. I've been so wrong about everything. Mr. Bennett, Emily's weak voice carried across the room. Amy told me about your mom. She was like us, wasn't she? Having trouble breathing. John moved closer, his own eyes wet. Yes, she was. Then she's breathing for all of us now, isn't she? The simple wisdom of a child cut through years of adult complexity. In that moment, watching Richard clutch both girls' hands, seeing Sarah's tears of hope rather than despair, John felt his mother's presence more strongly than ever. Yes, he whispered. I believe she is. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside that hospital room, something frozen began to thaw. The cycle of cruelty, maintained for generations, started to crack under the weight of two young girls' innocent friendship and three adults' choice to finally truly breathe. As this emotional journey unfolds, with Martha's spirit touching hearts across generations, we invite you to join our community of compassionate souls. If this story of healing, redemption, and breaking cycles of prejudice resonates with you, show your support with a simple let's breathe kindness into the world together. The following days brought both hope and heartbreak. While Emily and Amy responded well to their initial treatments, the emotional toll of past decisions weighed heavily on everyone involved. Late one night, as snow continued to blanket the city, Richard found himself alone in his empty house, surrounded by moving boxes. The furniture had been sold to pay for Emily's previous treatments. On his desk lay a stack of unopened bills and a foreclosure notice. Among them, a small photo album revealed a younger Richard with his father, Theodore Coleman. I became you, he whispered to his father's image. I destroyed myself trying not to become you and became you anyway." His hands trembled as he turned the pages, finding photographs of lavish parties at the mansion where Martha Bennett had worked. In one corner, barely visible, she stood in her uniform, a young John playing at her feet. Across town, Sarah sat beside Amy's hospital bed, counting the dwindling pills in her sister's prescription bottle. The insurance coverage from her job barely covered basic treatments. She'd been selling her belongings one by one, her grandmother's jewelry, her car, even her winter coat. The experimental treatment John offered seemed like a miracle, but the cost of getting there had been devastating. John, meanwhile, faced his own demons in his mother's old apartment in the Bronx. He'd kept it all these years, preserved exactly as she'd left it. The small Christmas tree they'd made from discarded magazine pages still stood in the corner, decorated with paper chains. Beneath it, he found something he'd forgotten, a child's gift wrapped in newspaper, addressed to Richie, my best friend. He'd never had the chance to give it to Richard that Christmas. By then, Theodore Coleman had banned their friendship, and Martha was already coughing. The real tragedy, John realized, wasn't just in the big moments: his mother's death, Richard's transformation, the girl's illness. It lay in the thousand small cruelties that had brought them here: every dismissed worker, every ignored plea for help, every time someone chose appearance over humanity. In the hospital cafeteria, an elderly custodian recognized Richard. "You fired my daughter last month," she said quietly. "She had worked at your store for 6 years. Now she can't afford her son's asthma medication." Richard's face crumpled. How many lives had he damaged trying to maintain his father's twisted legacy? The list of those he'd hurt seemed endless. Sarah discovered more painful truths in the store's records: dozens of qualified candidates rejected for their background, countless customers humiliated, families struggling because of reduced hours or lost jobs. Each story was a small tragedy, building to this moment. But perhaps the deepest cut came when John found his mother's diary, documenting her final weeks. Her last entry read, "I worry most for little Richie. Theodore is teaching him that kindness is weakness. Please, God, don't let that sweet boy become his father. And my Johnny, let him learn to forgive, even when the world is cruel. They were such beautiful friends once." The snow fell heavier that night as 3 people in different parts of the city faced the cost of choices made and paths taken. In the hospital, Emily and Amy slept peacefully, unaware of the adult world's complications, their hands still clasped between their beds, a symbol of the innocence that had been lost and perhaps could still be saved. In his office overlooking the snowy city, John faced the hardest decision of his life. Before him lay 2 paths, each with profound consequences. The evidence of Richard's discrimination was overwhelming, enough to not only fire him but to destroy him completely. One press release would end the Coleman legacy forever. Yet beside these documents sat his mother's final diary entry: "Forgiveness isn't for those who deserve it, Johnny. It's for those who need it most." Her wisdom seemed to echo through the years, challenging his sense of justice. Inside the hospital, Richard sat between the 2 girls' beds, his world collapsing around him. "Mr. Bennett," Emily whispered through her oxygen mask, "Daddy told me everything. About your mom, about what he did." Her small hand reached for his. "Sometimes when I can't breathe, I think about her. She must have been so scared, like me." Sarah's situation added another layer of complexity. Her sister's treatment was now secured, but other families still suffered under similar circumstances. "We can't save everyone," she admitted to John in a quiet moment. "But we can change the system that creates these situations." The moral dilemma crystallized one evening when Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman from the store, visited the hospital. She brought a box of old photographs, including one that stopped John's heart: his mother and Richard's mother, both domestic workers, sharing a lunch break. They were smiling, their children playing at their feet. "Your mothers were friends," Mrs. Thompson revealed. They made a pact to protect their sons from becoming hard like their employers. Martha kept her promise. Richard's mother. She died before she could keep hers. The weight of this revelation pressed heavily on John. Would destroying Richard honor his mother's memory or betray her deepest wishes? Would justice be served by perpetuating the cycle of destruction? Richard himself seemed to understand the magnitude of the choice facing John. "I don't ask for mercy," he said one evening, his voice rough with emotion. "But please, whatever you decide, help me make sure Emily doesn't inherit this poison. Let her keep her friendship with Amy. Don't let our father's sins taint another generation." The echoes of past decisions reverberated through the hospital corridors. Every labored breath from the girls' room reminded John of his mother's final struggles. Every act of kindness from the hospital staff stood in stark contrast to the cruelty that had defined the Coleman-Bennett history. As snow continued to fall outside, John stood at the window of his office holding his mother's worn wallet. Inside, he found something he'd never noticed before, a small note tucked behind the Coleman's impersonal sympathy card, in his mother's handwriting. "Johnny, remember that hate is a heavy burden to bear. I choose to leave you a lighter legacy, the power to break chains, not forge new ones. Love, Mom." The dilemma wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about the kind of world they would leave for Emily and Amy. Would they inherit a story of revenge and perpetual conflict, or one of breaking cycles and finding humanity in the darkest places? In the quiet of his office, as the city lights flickered through the falling snow, John Bennett prepared to make a decision that would either heal old wounds or create new ones. The weight of generations rested on his shoulders, and his mother's words echoed in his heart. The revelation came on a particularly harsh winter morning when an unexpected visitor arrived at John's office. Theodore Coleman himself, now elderly and frail, wheeled into the room by his nurse. The years had not been kind to him, but his eyes still held the same steely determination John remembered from his childhood. "I know what you're facing," Theodore said without preamble, his voice weak but clear. "The same choice I faced 20 years ago." John stood frozen, facing his mother's former employer. Theodore pulled out an old, creased envelope. "Before your mother died, she wrote this letter. Not the one asking for help, another one. I've carried it for 20 years, too much of a coward to share it." His hands shook as he passed it to John. The letter revealed a truth that shattered everything they thought they knew. "Dear Mr. Coleman, by the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. But there's something you need to know. That night when I found the evidence of your embezzlement, I didn't report it not because I feared you, but because of Richie. I saw how desperately you were trying to maintain appearances for him, selling your soul piece by piece to keep up the facade. I recognize that desperation. It's the same fear I feel for my Johnny. We want better for our children than we had ourselves. But in protecting them from poverty, we risk teaching them to value the wrong things. I'm dying, Mr. Coleman, but I die knowing Johnny will inherit something more valuable than money, the understanding that true worth isn't in what we own, but in how we treat others. Take care of Richie. Help him remember the boy who shared cookies with my son before status and appearances poisoned his heart. With hope. Martha Bennett." Theodore's voice cracked. "I found this letter the day after she died. By then I'd already started the cover-up that would eventually ruin me. I taught Richard that appearances matter more than people. I killed Martha Bennett twice, once with my negligence and again by teaching my son to become what I was." John stood by the window, his mother's final words burning in his hands. "Why show me this now?" "Because history is repeating itself," Theodore replied. "Richard became what I was because I taught him fear of losing status, fear of showing weakness. But Martha," his voice broke, "Martha taught you something stronger than fear. The old man pulled out another document bank statement showing regular anonymous deposits to various children's hospital funds over the past 20 years. Everything I had left, Theodore explained. Too late to save your mother, but maybe not too late to honor her choice. Richard doesn't know. I've watched him repeat my mistakes, watched him struggle with the same demons. But there's something neither of us knew about your mother's last days. He produced one final photograph, Martha Bennett in her hospital bed, with young Richard curled up beside her, both asleep. On the back was written his last visit. He promised to always remember the boy he was before fear changed him. She protected both of you, Theodore said quietly. Me, she left to face my conscience. But you boys, she gave you each other. The friendship you had was real. The kindness in Richard wasn't killed by my teachings. It went underground, fighting to survive. The snow fell silently outside as John absorbed these revelations. His mother's last act hadn't been one of defeat, but a profound hope that someday the cycle could be broken, that the boys who once shared cookies could find their way back to that simple truth. The revelation sparked a profound transformation, beginning in the most unexpected place, the hospital's children's ward. Richard, having read his father's confession and Martha's letter, spent a sleepless night watching Emily and Amy sleep. In the early hours, he began to write first a letter of resignation, then something more, a public confession detailing every discriminatory policy he'd enforced, every person he'd wronged. But between the lines of self-recrimination emerged another story of a frightened boy trying to preserve his father's legacy while secretly fighting against it. I haven't slept properly in years, he admitted to John the next morning. Every night I'd go back to the store after hours trying to undo the damage I'd done during the day, leaving money in lockers, making anonymous payments, writing recommendation letters for people I'd publicly dismissed. I thought I was protecting Emily by maintaining appearances, but I was just teaching her the same fear that destroyed me. Sarah's transformation was quieter but equally profound. She gathered the staff one morning not as an interim manager, but as someone who'd witnessed both cruelty and redemption. We've all been part of a system that values appearance over humanity, she said. But we've also seen what happens when we choose differently. Every time we helped someone against orders, every small act of kindness, that was us choosing Martha Bennett's legacy over fear. But the most dramatic change was in John himself. The anger that had driven him for 20 years began to shift, transformed by understanding. He saw now that his mother's last act wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about breaking the chains that bound them all. In a quiet moment at the hospital, Emily asked to see the photograph of young Richard and John playing together. You were friends, she said wonderingly, before all the grown-up stuff got in the way. We were, John replied, watching Richard tend to both girls with equal care. Can you be friends again, Amy asked, her oxygen mask fogging with each word. Because if we can be friends despite everything, maybe you can too. The wisdom of children cut through decades of adult complexity. John looked at Richard, not the man who'd perpetuated discrimination, but the boy who'd shared his cookies, who'd cried in Martha Bennett's arms, who'd spent years fighting himself in the dark. Theodore Coleman's presence forced them all to confront uncomfortable truths. He spent his remaining strength documenting his own transformation, recording a testimony that would become part of something larger than himself. Martha Bennett saw what I couldn't, he told them. That in trying to protect our children from poverty, we can make them poor in spirit. She died protecting not just her son, but mine too, protecting their capacity for kindness from my fear of weakness. The snow continued to fall outside the hospital windows, but inside the air grew warmer with each truth revealed, each mask removed. Emily and Amy grew stronger, not just from their treatments, but from witnessing the adults around them choose healing over hurt. One evening, Richard found a small newspaper-wrapped package in Emily's room, the Christmas gift John had never been able to give him all those years ago. Inside was a simple cookie tin with a note Mom always said sharing cookies was braver than keeping them to yourself. The transformation wasn't just personal, it rippled outward, touching everyone who witnessed it. The story of two boys separated by fear and reunited by truth began to change not just their lives, but the very culture they had helped create. 1 year later, on a snowy December morning, the flagship store on Fifth Avenue underwent a remarkable transformation. The grand reopening ceremony wasn't just about luxury retail, it was the launch of the Martha Bennett Foundation for Equal Opportunity. The store's entrance now bore a new plaque in honor of Martha Bennett, who taught us that true luxury is in how we treat each other inside. The changes were even more profound. The break room had been converted into a training center for disadvantaged youth, while a portion of every sale went to medical care for service workers' families. Richard, no longer the store manager, had found his true calling running the foundation's outreach programs. His office, once a symbol of exclusivity, now welcomed people from all walks of life seeking assistance and opportunities. My father taught me to fear poverty, he explained to a group of trainees. But Martha Bennett taught me something more valuable, that our worth isn't in what we own, but in what we give. Sarah had been promoted to Regional Director of Community Engagement, implementing programs that bridge the gap between luxury retail and social responsibility. Under her leadership, the store became a model for inclusive business practices. Emily and Amy, now fully recovered, had become the foundation's youngest ambassadors. Their friendship, which had helped break generations of prejudice, inspired a mentoring program pairing children from different social backgrounds. John transformed his entire business model. Every Bennett luxury store now included a community center and training facility. The Martha Bennett Scholarship Fund provided educational opportunities for service workers' children, while the healthcare initiative ensured no employee would ever face his mother's fate. Theodore Coleman, in his final act before passing, had donated his entire estate to the foundation. The mansion where Martha Bennett had worked became a residential training center for underprivileged youth entering the luxury retail industry. The most powerful symbol of change was the annual Martha Bennett Day of Service. Every December, on the anniversary of her passing, the stores closed for regular business and opened their doors to service workers and their families. Employees and customers served together, sharing meals and stories, breaking down the barriers that had once seemed so insurmountable. During that first celebration, Richard and John stood together watching Emily and Amy help serve meals to cleaning staff and their children. "Your mother would be proud," Richard said softly, "not just of what we've built, but of who we've become." John looked around at the gathered crowd, wealthy customers chatting with service workers, children from all backgrounds playing together, Sarah training a new group of employees in the art of treating everyone with dignity. "She knew," John replied, touching the worn wallet in his pocket. "She knew that true change doesn't come from revenge or success, but from remembering who we were before fear taught us to be something else." On Christmas Eve, as snow blanketed Fifth Avenue in white, the Martha Bennett Memorial Garden on the store's rooftop hosted a special gathering. Emily and Amy, dressed in matching holiday sweaters, helped decorate a tree made entirely of recycled magazines, a replica of the one John and his mother had created in their tiny apartment. Richard stood at the podium, his transformation complete. Gone was the proud, fearful man who had once guarded status so fiercely. In his place stood someone both humbler and stronger. 20 years ago, he began, two boys shared cookies in a basement kitchen, unaware of the barriers the world would build between them. Today, we're not just breaking down those barriers, we're building bridges in their place. The crowd represented every level of society. Luxury store clients sat beside maintenance staff, executives shared tables with cleaning crews, children from different worlds played together around the tree. Sarah, now a recognized leader in ethical business practices, stood with her sister Amy, both healthy and strong. John stepped forward, holding his mother's worn wallet. "My mother used to say that true luxury isn't about what we wear or own, it's about how we make others feel." Today, we're not just running stores, we're continuing her legacy of kindness. As if on cue, the doors opened to welcome a group of families, all former employees who had faced discrimination under Richard's management. But instead of anger, they were met with apologies, opportunities, and open arms. Theodore Coleman's nurse wheeled in his old chair, now repurposed as a reading nook in the children's section of the community center. Emily and Amy immediately claimed it, taking turns reading stories to younger children, a scene that would have once been unthinkable in a luxury store. The evening's highlight came when John unveiled a simple cookie jar, the same one from their childhood, now displayed prominently in the store's entrance. A reminder, he explained, that sharing what we have, whether it's cookies or kindness, multiplies its value. As snow continued to fall outside, the gathered crowd witnessed something remarkable. Richard and John, once divided by status and fear, sharing cookies with everyone present, just as they had done as children in Martha's kitchen. The final moment belonged to Emily and Amy, who had prepared a surprise. They led everyone in singing Amazing Grace, the same hymn Martha Bennett had sung while working, her voice carrying hope through the halls of wealth that had once excluded her. Above the garden, through breaks in the falling snow, stars twinkled over Fifth Avenue. John could almost hear his mother's voice in the winter wind. "See, Johnny, sometimes the greatest luxury is simply remembering who we really are." The Martha Bennett Foundation had transformed not just a business, but the lives it touched. In choosing kindness over fear, forgiveness over revenge, they had created something far more valuable than any luxury good, a legacy of hope that would outlive them all. In the end, it wasn't just about breaking cycles of prejudice, it was about creating new cycles of understanding, one shared cookie at a time. The end. Doesn't this story of redemption, human dignity, and breaking cycles of prejudice deserve your support? Hit the subscribe button, give it a like, and share Martha Bennett's powerful legacy with your family and friends. We'd love to hear your thoughts and the lessons this story has taught you in the comments below. From all of us who believe in the power of kindness over fear, thank you deeply for your continued support of our channel. Every subscription helps us spread more stories that matter.